আজকে শুরু করছি। Well, good morning, friends. Today I am going to deal with Tradition and the Individual Talent by T.S. Eliot. T.S. Eliot is considered to be one of the foremost modernist critics. The fact that he was both a creative and a critical writer gives to his critical writings both certain advantages and certain disadvantages. The advantages of critical writing produced by T.S. Eliot consist of the fact that because he was a writer of eminence, because he was writing poetry and plays along with his critical works, meant that he understood, number one, the times, number two, the sensitivity as well as the sensibilities of writers of that time. Are you getting my point? T.S. Eliot was also an editor. He was a poetry editor of favor and favor. So naturally, he was reading great deal of poems, quite a number of poems by other writers as well. And as a result, his acceptance of or rejection of other poets, number one, were based on certain principles. And number two, his acceptance or rejection of poets had very important literary influences, ramifications. You have to understand this. Now, because he was a writer, he was a poet, he was a practicing poet, he was a critic, a literary critic, a social critic, a cultural critic. So you have to understand that there were certain biases, certain prejudices, certain blind spots in his taste that actually influenced his choice of and attitude to poetry. What kind of poetry, what kind of poets he would love and hate? This was greatly determined by his ideas about poetry. Similarly, because he was an important writer, an important editor, an important critic, his opinions mattered. Because he was an intellectual as well as a creative artist. Because he was, as he has himself said, a classicist in literature. You have to understand his theory of impersonality. That poetry is not the letting loose of personality, but it was basically the negation of personality. He always said, T.S. Eliot always said that the man who suffered and the mind which created should be differentiated. That means A, B, or C, anyone amongst yourself. It may be anybody. It may be Bikram, it may be Shubhasri, it may be Shamim, anybody. Suppose you are a poet. Because he was a classicist, he as a poet was attached to the idea of tradition. Tradition. What others have done before you. How poetry has evolved in England. All these things meant a great deal to T.S. Eliot. You know. Mhm. Uh, Now, what does he say about tradition? He points out that a historical sense of what has been done before is very important in creating, in formulating the poetic sensibility. He said that whatever we read remains in our bones, whether you like it or not, whether you are aware of it or not. And that is why when we talk, the films we have seen, the books we have read, the speeches that we have listened to, the paintings that we have seen, all these actually influence both our thought and our expression. Understood? So, because poets are influenced in their thought as well as in their expression by whatever has been done in that culture, in that literary tradition. Because T.S. Eliot was an American who actually adopted the United Kingdom as his country, he was obviously talking about the Western tradition. But at the same time, you have to understand that T.S. Eliot was a cosmopolitan of the first order. He was not only a Francophile, but also an Indophile. French literature and culture, German literature and culture, Indian literature and culture, all these things actually influenced him. What does it mean? And what did it ultimately lead to? A deep rooted historical sense. Here, while talking about the historical sense, he is not so much talking about an isolation between literary history and life history. Historical sense is a comprehensive sense of what has gone before and how it has left an imprint on us. He talks about the pastness of the past and its presence. The past, what kind of person you have been, what kind of education you have had, what kind of social cultural exposures you have had, all these actually influence you. And because they influence you, they are not over when the event is over, when the time is past. They remain in some ways as a serious, substantial influence, even though not palpably experienced, They remain. And that is what he calls the presentness or presence of the past. You have to understand this. The past is there. What you have done, the kind of friendships you have made, all these things actually lead to your life being put in a particular channel. Obviously, your art, your literature also in a particular channel. And this literature is influenced by what the past is, what the past has been. So when an Englishman, when a Frenchman, when a German man, when an American man starts writing, he cannot ignore the prior existence and eminence of people like Homer, people like Horace, people like Dante. So they are there. And sometimes, this is actually Eliot's view, not mine. Eliot seems to say that, that sometimes what happens is we want to remain very original. Now, originality is something that T.S. Eliot questions, interrogates as a concept. Man's life has always been reflected in literature. Ups and downs, events and incidents, the basic emotions and experiences, all these things have been experienced and expressed both in life and in art by man down millennia, হাজার হাজার বছর থেকে মানুষ এইগুলো লিখে গেছে, এই নিয়ে লিখে গেছে। তাহলে দেখো, বেসিক লাইফ অফ ম্যান হ্যাজ নট চেঞ্জড ওভার দ্য ইয়ার্স। Incidents may come and go. For example, in T.S. Eliot's poetry, the importance of the First and the Second World War cannot be underestimated. You have to understand this. Even though T.S. Eliot was not writing directly about the First World War or the Second World War, even though he was not a war poet in that sense of the term, he was not impervious to what happened. He was not impervious to what the results and influences had been. For example, when he wrote The Wasteland, you think about it, it is a land that has gone to waste. It is a wasted land. Why? Because the land is fertile or barren, livable or not livable, not only on the basis of what it has to offer physically. The associations are also important. For example, you go to a place, suppose somebody was murdered in a room, you don't want to stay there. Suppose somebody had committed suicide in a room, you do not want to stay there. You call them haunted houses. Now, the First World War meant that the social, political, religious institutions had all crumbled. Man was forced to stand and face the organized butchery of boys. What man can do to other men, those with whom we didn't have any quarrels, we kill them. You think about the Strange Meeting by Wilfred Owen. He says, I am the enemy you killed my friend, in string meeting. Personal animosity does not count. It is all a question of national command. It is all about some kind of a cultivated command structure. Okay? And man could understand that neither family nor society, neither state nor religion would or could save him. This led to an existential crisis. Man was not getting any other props. He was feeling alone, lonely, deserted, left to fight for himself. So these things influenced Eliot's poetic output. At the same time, it also influenced his critical works. And that actually accounts for his insistence on a historical sense. Man, or poets for that matter, should have this historical sense. Now, if you think about war, writing about war, now that has already been done by Homer in the Iliad and the Odyssey. If you think about the quest for the savior, quest for a talisman, that has been done in the Middle Ages, for example, dream of the root, and so on and so forth. So T.S. Eliot understood that originality is not in finding out a new theme to write about. It is about finding out newer nuances in the old themes and poetic motifs. Understood? So obviously the personality of the poet, according to Eliot, meant very little. And that is why he says that it should be an eraser of personality. If you differentiate the man who suffers from the mind which creates, obviously you will gain some kind of an objectivity, and that's what Eliot wanted. Now you may ask me, sir, then where is the place for individual talent? T.S. Eliot has made use of a very, very interesting phrase: supervention of novelty. Newness, new things are to be introduced to the poetic mix. How? Whenever a new poem is written, it not only adds to the store of poetry, it also disturbs that store of poetry, because while adding a new member, you are actually destabilizing the status quo. You are actually disturbing and creating a new order in that sense. What are you doing? You are actually taking up the tradition that you find and rearranging it ever so slightly. So it not only adds to but disturbs the order, because the relationship that each previous book, each previous poem had amongst the others, all the poems, and with the with the tradition was changed by the arrival of a new poem, a new poet. Freshness of observation, freshness of expression. This meant that there was a freshness of interpretation also. Okay. Now, what does T.S. Eliot have to say about the poetic process? What, for example, has he got to say about the role of the poet? I have already told you that he talked about poetry, he discussed poetry, he defined uh, the poetic process in a particular way. Acha. He actually made you to understand that the poet has to internalize and imbibe all experiences, both vital and literary. Whatever he sees, hears, and experiences through his senses, and whatever he reads about and reads. So, in a way, the poet's mind is that like a container that contains all the experiences and impressions that he has had. But at the same time, he mildly contradicts himself by when he says that the poet's mind is like not only the receptacle, it is like the catalyst. You know, onughotok or catalyst is something, a kind of a chemical that does not take part in the chemical process, that is not changed by the chemical process, but its presence actually either hastens or retards the chemical reaction. So he, at another place, after having compared the poet's mind to a receptacle, now he is actually talking about the poet's mind as a catalyst, which facilitates experience being transformed into expression, which facilitates in the writing of. Now, this is something you have to understand because I have already given you ample material that will help you in writing your answers. I have already started collecting more materials on both tradition and the individual challenge and on modern fiction. I'm doing that. But what I have tried today through this lecture is to give you an idea of what the essay is all about. Okay. Pick up speed I have tried to speak to you, talk to you in the old way that I used to have. But again, I am finding out that I am physically not yet adequate to the task. And that's why I don't want to go on at this point of time. So if you have any queries, you may ask them. Otherwise, you have to disconnect me, remove me from the meeting. Understood? Hello?
স্যার ভালো থাকবেন।
ঠিক আছে।